Let us begin looking at the ventricular system. We're going to have a look at the shapes of the lateral ventricles and the third ventricle, and we're also going to identify the interventricular foramina, also known as the foramina of Monroe, and we're going to identify the cerebral aqueduct. So we're going to start off with a model, and looking at the brain from the front, or equally from the back, we have a lateral ventricle here, a lateral ventricle here. These connect not to each other, but to the third ventricle. The third ventricle connects to the fourth ventricle, and then the fourth ventricle is continuous with the spinal canal. So the important thing to note from the offset is that the lateral ventricles do not connect to each other. They both individually connect to the third ventricle. The shape I want you to think about in your head when you're drawing the lateral ventricles is a Y, the letter Y, but on its side. So this is pretty much the shape of the lateral ventricles except to its side, and you'll see what I mean now. You come around, goes back a bit, comes forward again, not as much forward as the bit at the top, but still quite forward, and then around, and then we have a gap for the connection to the third ventricle. So just to draw in your head, you're looking at the brain from the lateral aspect. The nose is going to be over here, as this guy shows. Okay, it's pretty self-explanatory. What you're not seeing in this diagram is the lateral ventricle that's behind the other lateral ventricle, the one that's behind this. So let's do this in a slightly less dense pen. It's going to come around and then dot, 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 something like this. Oh. And this is also going to connect to the third ventricle. So then we have the third ventricle, which is basically somewhere around here. Moving on to the third ventricle, I would like to remind you that in a previous video I suggested thinking of the thalami like eggs. So if my hands are now the thalami, and my thumbs become the interthalamic adhesion, well, the third ventricle is going to be the space around here. This part of the thalamus here is going to be the walls of the third ventricle. So when we sever the brain in the mid-sagittal plane, we're going to be cutting through this bit of flesh, and that's the little circle you see in the brain that we've been drawing, and it's also the circle you're about to see now in the third ventricle. So this circle is actually flesh that goes kind of through the third ventricle, because the third ventricle goes around. I think you get the message. Now, in the brain that we've been drawing so far, we draw our pons and our midbrain and our dura oblongata, and then the back of the brainstem comes down here and does a little W, and then we bring it up and around, something to this effect. For the moment, I just want you to think of simply another W, except on its side, like this, for the third ventricle, and then that we come around. So all this space here, down here into these little parts of the W, is the third ventricle, and this bit here is the interthalamic adhesion. Now, what's not drawn here is the connections from the lateral ventricles to the third ventricle. So we can just mark in one here, and then in the background what you're not seeing is the other one. Okay, so these two W's are pretty important. They each part here, like this part here, and this part here, and this part here, and this part here, all of these have individual names, and what we call them are recesses. So this is going to be one recess, and this is going to be another recess, and this is going to be another recess, and this is going to be another recess, and we're going to look at the names of those in the next video or something. Now, coming off the third ventricle at the bottom, we have the connection to the fourth ventricle, and that is called the cerebral aqueduct. And then we have the fourth ventricle down here, which we're not going to look at the shape of in this video. Okay, so I would like to attempt drawing the entire ventricular system. Let's start with the lateral ventricles. We're going to draw a Y, And then I'm going to draw the other lateral ventricle, which is behind it. And this also connects to the third ventricle. Okay, this is really not going to be to scale or anything, but just to have the general idea in our head. The third ventricle is in the middle of the brain. And we have the W, then we have this W, then we have the interthalamic adhesion, and then we have it goes down to the cerebral aqueduct, and then we have the fourth ventricle, which is something like this, and then we have the spinal canal. So actually that wasn't, I think, too hard to draw if you separate it into little parts. So just to recap, we have the two lateral ventricles, which you can remember as a kind of a Y on its side, and then they connect individually via the foramina of Monroe to the third ventricle, which has a W on the bottom, which we've been drawing in all the previous videos, and then another W to the side. We have the third ventricle, and then the third ventricle becomes the cerebral aqueduct, and then we have the fourth ventricle, and then we have the spinal canal.